Robert Brotherton is based at the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmith College, University of London. As part of his research, he has developed the Generic Conspiracist Belief Scale. Rob, research regarding the psychological belief in conspiracy theory has often been limited due to the absence of a conceptual definition of what constitutes a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory. With this in mind, could you please discuss the Generic Conspiracist Belief Scale that you have developed and how this helps to shed insight into the phenomena that is conspiracy theory and also the beliefs that encompass this phenomena?
The Generic Conspiracist Belief Scale, the GCB that we've been working on, in many ways it grew out of the initial task of trying to figure out what a conspiracy theory is, what that label means. And so you're absolutely right when you say that the majority of psychological research has just kind of neglected the issue entirely of articulating a working definition of what conspiracy theory is. And I think that's because it's relied on the fact that people have a kind of intuitive definition, an intuitive idea of what we mean when we're talking about conspiracy theories. So most people, I think, without articulating a definition, most people can agree upon what is a conspiracy theory and what's not a conspiracy theory. But obviously in science, it's usually a good idea to try and nail down these concepts and articulate your definitions. And most psychological research hasn't really gone beyond saying that a conspiracy theory postulates a plot by powerful groups of people, usually towards some sinister end, and is usually unfalsifiable. And so I think that's a reasonable start. It's a good beginning. But right at the beginning of my PhD, I wanted to try and extend upon that and go further than that and see if I could offer a more detailed conceptualization of conspiracy theory. So to begin with, I read a lot of dictionary definitions and a lot of the philosophical work that's been done on conspiracy theories and a lot of what conspiracy theorists themselves say as well. And the common theme that I noticed amongst all that is they adopt a kind of all-inclusive definition, essentially along the lines of a conspiracy theory is any theory which postulates a conspiracy. And I would say that linguistically and semantically, perhaps that definition makes sense, but I would argue that for our purposes as social scientists researching these beliefs, I would say that that kind of definition is worse than useless. It's misleading. It simply doesn't convey what most people mean when they talk about conspiracy theories. And it's not what we, certainly as psychologists, it doesn't get at the kind of beliefs that we're interested in studying. So the main problem with it is that conspiracies occur all the time. Nobody's contesting that. And but we're simply not interested in every theory about a conspiracy. So a good example, I think, would be to do with 9/11. So there's the official story, if you want to call it that, would be labeled a conspiracy theory according to that definition. So the official story is that members of Al-Qaeda conspired to perpetrate the attacks. But of course, as psychologists, that's not what we mean when we talk about conspiracy theories. And when the general public, I think, talk about conspiracy theories, that's not what they mean. Whereas the alternative explanation of 9/11, the idea that it was an inside job perpetrated somehow by members of the US government, that I would argue is a conspiracy theory according to popular usage and according to the kind of beliefs that we're interested in studying. So the problem is, what exactly is the difference between the what I would call the conspiracy theory of 9/11 and the official story of 9/11? Why is one a conspiracy theory but the other one isn't? So in my thesis, right at the beginning, that's what I wanted to do, is basically try and expand on the existing limited psychological definitions that have been put forward and try and offer a more slightly more complete and well-articulated conceptualization of conspiracy theory by specifying the features which distinguish conspiracy theories from non-conspiracy theory. So in doing that, I read basically every conspiracy theory that I could come across, a lot of kind of catalogs and compendiums of popular conspiracy theories, a lot on the internet and stuff like that. And I came up with these kind of common identifying characteristics. So one of them, well, the first thing to say is a conspiracy theory is an unsubstantiated claim of conspiracy. And I know that that in itself is might be a contentious issue, because what constitutes unsubstantiated? But I think it's reasonable enough to say that a conspiracy theory is an unproven claim. Another characteristic is that these claims usually pertain to some events of obvious national or global significance, such as assassinations of important people, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and things like that. Another characteristic is that a conspiracy theory is not an isolated explanation. It exists and is in competition with an alternative and a more plausible and evidence-based explanation for the same event, which is labeled by conspiracy theorists the official explanation. And the conspiracy theory will postulate endemic deception and misinformation. So the official story is never just kind of a mistaken hypothesis, but rather it's a deliberate fraud designed by the conspirators to mislead the public. Another characteristic that I identified is the conspirators are usually assumed to be tyrannically evil and hyper-competent, by which I mean that they're so powerful that nothing occurs by accident. Everything is within their control, and they're usually bent on world domination somehow. And so a couple of final characteristics that I came up with are conspiracy theories generally lack positive evidence. They're based instead on kind of picking holes in the official story, finding anomalies and hidden connections. And ultimately, they're unfalsifiable. They're self-insulating against questioning or correction. So in my thesis, I consider each of these features in some detail, but I think the important thing to note is they're not black and white objective criteria. There's quite a lot of subjectivity in there. It's a matter of interpretation. But I would argue that this kind of family resemblance approach towards operationalizing conspiracy theory, I think, is the most useful approach. And I would say that formulating a more succinct and precise definition based on objective criteria, I would say that's neither necessary nor possible. I think this kind of family resemblance approach is the most useful approach towards conceptualizing conspiracy theory. And we can use that to guide our research by trying to focus on the most prototypical examples of conspiracy theories, the one which best kind of typify these characteristics that I've talked about.
Now, Rob, analytically, you've been dealing with the semantic, linguistic, and conceptual definitions with regards to the phenomena of conspiracy theory. And I just wanted to get your opinion and thoughts on the potentially different types of conspiracy theories that exist and how one could incorporate this into some kind of model for study in the social sciences. So to give an example of a particular type of conspiracy theory is something like 9/11 or the JFK conspiracy. That is that they exist at single points in time in history. They are one-off events that can be explained by certain sinister deeds and nefarious agents with the political, social and economic goal to further extract some kind of power from society and rule over the populace, who of course are oblivious to these conspiratorial phenomena. Now this is a single point conspiracy theory. Simultaneously, what can happen here is that this single point conspiracy theory can be subsumed under a meta-conspiracy theory, and there are two types of conspiracy theory, and one is the metaphysical conspiracy theory, and that would be a conspiracy theory such as David Icke that links conspiracies such as 9/11 under the larger all-encompassing remit that it is a conspiracy enacted by extraterrestrial shape-shifting reptiles. This is a metaphysical conspiracy because it essentially challenges the ontological world that we exist in, whether it's socially, materially, or naturalistically in terms of scientific research. It essentially says that consciousness and energy is what drives the universe, and we're under the spell of reptilian aliens, and this is something akin to something like the Scientologists that believe consciousness and energy rules the world. That's a metaphysical conspiracy theory. Alternatively, but you could also have this linked under a metaphysical conspiracy, is a historically continuing conspiracy theory, and that would be a conspiracy such as one coming from the ancient world that may involve the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the New World Order, the Bilderberg Group, and these are the people throughout history that enact events like Pearl Harbor, like JFK, like the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the First World War, 9/11. So under these meta-conspiracy theories, the meta-historically continuing conspiracies, 9/11 can be a single-point conspiracy, but at the same time it can be umbrellaed under a meta-historically continuing conspiracy theory. That is, one conspiracy is part of a larger historical meta-conspiracy. And in terms of the tiers and scales, you could say that this meta-historically continuing conspiracy theory could be subsumed under the metaphysical conspiracy theory, and that is something that David Icke does. He takes single-point conspiracy theories in social, political, and the economic domain, puts them under a meta-historical conspiracy going from the ancient world throughout history, and then puts that under the metaphysical ontological conspiracy theory regarding universal consciousness and reptilian aliens. What are your thoughts and opinions on the different types of conspiracy theories, whether we can classify and divide them along such lines, and whether they would be useful for building models for explanatory forms of conspiracy theory?
It's an interesting question, whether there are different types of conspiracy theory, and our work on the Generic Conspiracist Belief Scale kind of speaks to that, and we kind of find some of the same distinctions that you've been talking about. So what we did with the GCB essentially was following on from thinking about this kind of conceptualization of conspiracy theories in terms of these generic characteristics, identifying characteristics. I needed to figure out the best way to measure beliefs in conspiracy theories, and I thought, well, if we can define it in terms of these general generic characteristics, then maybe we can measure it by asking kind of generic questions. And so what we did was we initially came up with this long list of 75 generic items, each of which referred to a different kind of generic conspiracist idea, which could support belief in a real-world popular conspiracy theory. So as an example, instead of asking specifically about 9/11, we had items which asked participants to rate their endorsement of the idea that government-sanctioned terrorist activities against their own people are commonplace. So we had a lot of these items. We tried to cover every kind of conspiracy theory that we could think of and come across. And we had 500 people fill in this questionnaire rating their endorsement of each item. And following that, we used kind of standard statistical techniques to look for clustering of items within that. And we did find those clusters. In fact, they reduced down to just 5 underlying dimensions. And so the 5 clusters that we identified, the first one was we called government malfeasance. And so that refers to conspiracy theories concerning the government, obviously, government-sanctioned assassinations, false flag attacks, misleading the public, and so on. The second cluster we found was to do with extraterrestrial conspiracy theories, so the idea that aliens exist and are visiting the Earth, possibly colluding with the government to harm us, and so on. The third cluster we found had to do with global domination conspiracy theories. The world is ruled by small groups of powerful elites, such as the Illuminati, Freemasons, New World Order, and so on. And they're secretly manipulating world events from behind the scenes. The fourth cluster we found we called personal well-being conspiracy theories, and so these concern theories uh, like water fluoridation is a method of mind control, and secret use of mind control technology, microchipping, and so on. The final cluster we found we called control of information theories. So the idea that scientists or politicians or the media routinely kind of cover up important information that would be in the public interest out of sort of sinister self-interest and things like that. So these are the kind of 5 underlying dimensions that our statistical analyses came up with. And the important thing to say, though, is that they're not kind of independent dimensions. We found that each one correlated pretty strongly and positively with each other factor. So they all kind of hang together. Somebody who rates highly on one, say government malfeasance, will tend to rate the other ones highly as well. And so I would say that I don't necessarily see these as separate and distinct types of conspiracy theory, but rather I think they're 5 higher order assumptions or beliefs about the world which themselves can give rise to and promote beliefs in specific conspiracy theories. And so looking at sort of real world conspiracy theories, take, for example, the idea that the U.S. government is colluding with extraterrestrials to enslave humans through water fluoridation or something like that. That kind of, you can see how that mixes and matches from all of these 5 dimensions that we've identified. And I think most, if not all, conspiracy theories in the real world will have some element of each of these. And so some might lean more heavily on one. So the idea that the Illuminati is controlling world events is obviously primarily a global domination conspiracy theory. But I don't think that that these reflect distinct types of conspiracy theory. I think that conspiracy theories themselves all result from the same kind of underlying conspiracist mindset.
Initially, I'm not surprised that in the modern world, people are less likely to believe in meta single-point conspiracy theories, essentially because of the multi-complex and multi-layered phenomena that occurs socially on a global scale. So I'm not surprised that it's more difficult for people today in a globalized world to believe that there are single points of conspiratorial dictatorship that plans world events, and thus other world events stem from these in terms of a top-down scale. But what is interesting to note there is that they're less likely to reject conspiracy theories. And I believe one issue to do with this is because of the conceptual and semantic definitions that we're dealing with when we mean a conspiracy theory. So on the one hand, people are not as willing to believe that there is a New World Order conspiracy or an Illuminati conspiracy that is basically comprised of people in smoke-filled rooms dictating world events like backstage in a theatre, and we have subsequent events like JFK, 9/11. And yet, and this ties in with your intuitive understanding of what a conspiracy is, people know that conspiracies exist. They know this from their personal everyday experience, and they also know that agencies and organisations, whether they're business or government, do manipulate information or hold back information altogether. And of course we see this prominently and quite conspicuously come across within particular types of media sites such as WikiLeaks. So we know that people can conspire, but a problem, as we're getting to the bottom of, is what constitutes this conceptual definition of a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory, and thus how people within the social sciences can study them further. But at the same time, where your scale has demonstrated that there are certain constructs that are highly correlated together, we can begin to at least map out a certain personality type that believes in a conspiracy theory. Now, what's fascinating here is where do you draw the line between when it's rational or reasonable to accept a conspiracy theory and when it's not? And I'd like you to expand, because I know you and your colleagues have been doing quite a bit of work on the personality type that is somewhat attracted to believing or at least speculating about conspiracy theories. They tend to be associated with other conspiracies. That is, if you believe one conspiracy theory, you may be more likely to believe in others. And also fundamentally here, when we're dealing about cognition, is the contradictory cognitive dissonance that becomes present within a psychological schema of these people that believe in conspiracy theories. And this is a point that somewhat alluded to already. That is, the conspiratorial agents are hyper competent on the one hand. That is, nothing is beyond their control or their domain of execution. They plan everything, nothing is left to random chance, and they are responsible for everything that happens. Yet on the other hand, they're hyper incompetent and hyper inefficient because they go around leaving clues for conspiracy theories to find all the time. Now, this presents a significant cognitive dissonance because to operate in this psychological schema, one has to believe that an agent or agency can be simultaneously hyper competent and hyper inefficient. And I would like you to discuss how one begins to at least identify and then study these contradictory and paradoxical cognitive functions that are involved in some of the personality traits behind people that believe in conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that kind of goes back to the use of evidence and how conspiracy theorists support what they believe. And there's a lot of cherry picking and selective interpretation of the evidence. And so, like you say, the conspirators, for the most part, are assumed to be hyper competent and able to control everything, able to perfectly plan and execute events. And on the other hand, they can slip up and leave little clues. And yeah, I think from the outside that looks like an inconsistency in the belief system, but from the inside, I think it can be justified to make sense. It can be shoehorned to fit in with the theory, and so it speaks towards one of the not personality traits, but kind of socio-cognitive biases and illusions, which has been studied, which is the confirmation bias, which is the tendency to seek information which is consistent with our pre-existing beliefs and either ignore or distort anything which goes against what we already believe. And so that's one of the few of these cognitive biases which has been studied in relation specifically to conspiracy theories, specifically in terms of the JFK conspiracy theories. So in one study from 1995, I think, participants were presented with information both supporting and against the conspiracy theory of JFK's assassination. Participants' beliefs about the conspiracy theories were measured before they read this and after they read it. And unsurprisingly, the people who started off believing the conspiracy theory tended to remember more of the evidence consistent with that and rated it as being more plausible and better quality evidence. And ultimately, their belief was shifted in that direction. Their belief in the conspiracy was strengthened. And on the other hand, the same was true of the skeptics, people who started off believing that there was no conspiracy, that it was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. They found the evidence consistent with that to be more compelling, and their attitude was shifted in that direction as well. And so I think, we're all susceptible to the confirmation bias, and that can be one factor which permits conspiracy theories to exist and to persist despite this kind of the occasional contradictions, like the conspirators slipping up and making a mistake.
And obviously, by the very nature of psychological phenomenon cognition, that argument can actually be employed quite ironically by conspiracy theories, and they may say that that's how skeptics like us operate because we're looking for a confirmation bias. So in that respect, it's kind of a riddle that you can't get out of to a certain extent. I was thinking, what your thoughts were in terms of, because conspiracy theories are, well, what you said at the top of the conversation was everyone intuitively knows what a conspiracy theory is at a basic, fundamental, crude level. We experience these in our everyday lives. There's that kind of conspiracy, but then obviously you've specified this conceptual definition, and then you've got similarities or family resemblance when we talk about a conspiracy theory. So, for example, we know that the conspiracy theory of 9/11 being an inside job by certain government agents is a different type of conspiracy theory to the Italian League having bribery and corruption with referees. They're both to a certain extent involved operations in the background that go against official organised protocol, but they're two different types of conspiracy theories. And with this in mind, because, for example, say it's your birthday and two people have conspired with other people to throw you a surprise party, that's a conspiracy, technically at a basic level, but it's not the kind of conspiracy theory that would relate to something like JFK, 9/11, or even David Icke's alien reptilian theory. And just wanted to get your opinion on how you think that this fundamental phenomenon that we experience in everyday lives, how that can essentially be dangerous when we extrapolate that out of everyday situations and kind of put it into a bigger picture of the social world and how that operates. Do you see any errors with? It's similar along the lines of the hyper agency detective kit that most people obviously have, and obviously I know there's been work by psychologists and evolutionary psychologists in this area that tried to link that to the belief in the concept of a god, and then hyper agency again into random social phenomena that just happens by accident can be attributed to agency, and that's another branch where conspiracy theories can kind of come into the picture and fill the void of explanation, because then you're possibly left with random tragic events just happening because they can, and then obviously it's A, more comforting to believe that there's agency behind it, and B, certain bits of our mind are predisposed to seek out agency. Going back to personality traits, I know there's quite a bit of research that you've already alluded to yourself, and it's been around for a few years now, which is people that believe in one conspiracy theory are likely to believe in other conspiracy theories. And also I was speaking to Chris French about this kind of research, which is Karen Douglas at the University of Kent, which is people that endorse certain conspiracy theories are more likely to have conspired themselves in a conspiracy operation. So if you could just expand on how, what you think there is in terms of if you're paranoid and then you can project this paranoia into the outside social world, whether conspiracy theories then really do become about the evidence and how you manipulate this in the social world, or whether it is some kind of psychological disposition that people have, or a mixture of both, i.e. are there external factors that influence belief in popular conspiracy theories, or is it internal psychological factors, or a mixture of both?
Yeah, well, I would say it's probably definitely a mixture of both. Belief formation is never kind of simple and straightforward, and it's incredibly hard to detangle all these psychological and external factors that can contribute towards beliefs. But yeah, the internal kind of psychological factors, there are two kind of broad domains in which it's been researched. There's kind of stable personality traits, and I talked about paranoia already, and then there's kind of the socio-cognitive biases and illusions, which are they're common to us all. We're all kind of susceptible to them. They're an inbuilt part of our kind of cognitive architecture. And so I talked about the confirmation bias already, which we're all susceptible to, and I think that can help maintain beliefs in conspiracy theories. But then there's a couple of biases which have been studied, which I think might contribute towards the formation of conspiracist beliefs, which I think is particularly interesting. And one of them that you mentioned is the projection bias, which has been studied by Karen Douglas at University of Kent. And so essentially what she found is that people who admit that they themselves, if they were in the situation, would probably take part in a conspiracy, like killing Princess Diana, like hoaxing the moon landing. Somebody who says that they probably would do that, given the chance, is more likely to rate it plausible that that in fact happened, that the moon landing was faked, or that Princess Diana was murdered. And so the explanation that Karen Douglas offers for that is the projection bias. So we're projecting our own kind of dispositions and thoughts and behaviors onto assuming that other people would act much the same way that we ourselves would. And so if we reckon that we would probably conspire ourselves, then through the projection bias, we reckon that most other people would. And if most other people would, then it becomes more plausible that historically some of them actually went through with it. And so I think that's really interesting. And there's only been that one study by Karen Douglas, so I think it's something worth following up. And there's been a couple of other studies looking at different cognitive biases. So one of them is the proportionality bias, which is basically we're biased towards seeking proportionally big or intricate or complex causes for big, intricate, complex events. So when something of momentous significance happens, like the assassination of a president, JFK, or something like that, because of this proportionality bias, we look for big, significant explanations, like the nefarious conspiracy that's been going on for years involving hundreds of people. The idea that it could have been just one guy who nobody ever heard of just woke up one day and killed the most important person on the planet, because of this bias, that seems like an unsatisfactory explanation, I think. It defies this kind of intuitive logic of the proportionality bias. And so that's another of these mental shortcuts that could lead to the formation of conspiracy beliefs. And the other one that's been looked at is what Michael Shermer calls the patternicity bias. So we're kind of biased towards seeking meaning in ambiguous information, and even in completely random noise, people will still kind of see patterns and meaning. Because, like you alluded to before, I think you called it filling the void. I think psychological researchers have called it illusory control. By seeing meaning and patterns in this chaotic information, it affords us some degree of understanding, possibly illusory understanding, and thus control, illusory control. And so it's appealing to believe in a conspiracy because it is unappealing to believe in chaos and randomness. So the idea that Princess Diana, one of the most well-known and popular people on the planet at the time, the idea that she could have just been killed in a kind of freak, tragic car accident, that doesn't seem fitting. Whereas the idea that there was some kind of ongoing conspiracy to take her out, that restores understanding and control and affords you some degree of predictability. So if you think there is this conspiracy, then you can be on the lookout for, what they're going to do next.
We've got certain psychological traits, we've got certain sociological factors that cause people to believe in conspiracy theories and believe in some conspiracy theories over others. So we've got a possible psychological schema, and we've got external forces that influence people and their beliefs in conspiracy theory, and a large part of that again is to do with the actual study of why people believe what they do, which is almost like a separate domain but links into something like a conspiracy theory, because of course it's still a part of belief. But once you get past that level, one bit that interests me, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this as a psychologist in terms of broader social movements, is that once you believe this and endorse this, and then you become involved in a community that believes and endorses this itself, then it becomes a social movement like any other political or social movement. And to a certain extent, it may turn out to be something akin to tribalism, but the same way that conservatives move together and obviously endorse their party and associate with other conservatives, the same with socialists, they have their own views. When it comes to conspiracy theories, do you think that some of these conspiracy theories, when they become a social movement, is actually more about just finding commonplace and bonding with someone else and actually really endorsing those conspiracy theories? Because the potential difference in characteristics between people that follow conspiracy theories, so someone like David Icke or Alex Jones, who's very popular, has a lot of followers, but I wouldn't be surprised at all, and I don't think no one would, if the psychological makeup and the motivational factors behind their followers are completely different from the motivations and certain aspects of the psychological makeup of the leaders like David Icke and Alex Jones. So I just wanted to, if you have any thoughts on conspiracy theories as a social movement in itself, akin to other political movements, and if you had any views on the difference between the leader and the followers in terms of like a messiah and the herd following complex.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and something that, as far as I know, hasn't been researched at all. It would be really interesting if we could, but I suspect that people like Alex Jones and David Icke and these kind of prominent conspiracy theorists would be reluctant to take part in our research. Like, I find a lot of the kind of hardcore conspiracy theorists, for lack of a better term, they're extremely suspicious of any kind of social scientist, anyone who's researching these beliefs from a kind of skeptical point of view or looking at characteristics of the people who believe the theories. They tend to assume that we have an agenda. We're trying to smear conspiracy theorists, make them look bad, which really isn't the case at all. We're just, I mean, as far as the research goes, we're neutral towards whether the theories are true or not. We're just interested in objectively what are the characteristics of people who believe them versus people who don't. As far as conspiracy theories as a social movement, that's another interesting question which hasn't been researched much at all, I believe. I know there's a PhD student at University of Kent, Daniel Jolly, who's working with Karen Douglas, and his PhD is kind of concerns the consequences of believing in conspiracy theories, both the negative consequences in terms of, well, things like climate change, anti-vaccinationism, and so on, how they can be damaging, but then as well how they might be positive in terms of giving people a kind of social identity, meeting up with other conspiracy theorists and stuff like that. I think it's definitely possible that for some people it could be a positive force in their life. It certainly seems that a lot of conspiracy theorists, it becomes an intrinsic part of their self-identity, believing in the conspiracy. And so to that extent, it might be a positive force for some people. But then I find as well that these conspiracy groups can be quite schismatic and quite distrusting of their own. If one conspiracy theorist tends to, well, if they're mainly in agreement, but one conspiracy theorist disagrees over something, the others might disown them. I saw this firsthand where I took part in this event at Conway Hall about a year ago, a little bit more. And it was mostly academics and psychologists like myself giving talks on our work. And then we had one conspiracy theorist, professional conspiracy theorist, Ian R. Crane, who makes his living going around talking about 9/11 being an inside job and stuff like that. And so he gave his presentation, and about half the audience were, I would say, conspiracy theorists, and half were skeptics and scientists and stuff. And so it was an interesting day. Then in the pub afterwards, I was talking to one of the conspiracy theorists who'd come along, and we were talking about Ian R. Crane and his talk and stuff like that. And this guy I was talking to disagreed over a couple of points, but mainly, he agreed that 9/11 was an inside job. And so I said to him, if that's true, if it was an inside job, why is Ian R. Crane allowed to go around talking about it? Talking to thousands of people, trying to convince them that it was an inside job. If it was a conspiracy, why isn't he just silenced? And this guy replied to me that he thinks Ian R. Crane is a government agent of disinformation, trying to make them look bad and discredit them. So I thought that was really interesting, and I've seen that in other places as well, where conspiracy theorists will just disown other conspiracy theorists, whereas you might expect them to all be kind of supportive of each other.
From my perspective, two aspects that influence that. One, of course, is obviously the paranoid nature of some of these people that make up these conspiracy theory movements. Okay, some people might believe in some conspiracy theories, but as you were saying, like your fundamentalist conspiracy theories, that is paranoid and wary about all situations. So it's quite ironic and slightly hilarious that you might say in certain situations that you're going to have a room full of slightly above average paranoid people who believe in conspiracy theories, and then they start becoming paranoid about their own actual community themselves. That's quite logically and easy to understand why that happens. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect, I believe, is the conspiracy theory itself becomes a meta-political movement. So no longer have you got psychological characteristics that make up these groups, usually quite paranoid people, so they're more easily and readily used to distrusting other people in their community. And secondly, the actual political phenomenon is up for debate. So whether they're right or whether they're wrong about conspiracy theory is up for debate. And this is what happens quite a lot of the time. There's an American guy called Eric Phelps he's not a superstar like Alex Jones, but he's quite known. There's also another guy who's actually Irish as well called Michael Tessarion. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's quite a spiritualist, conspiracy theorist. And Eric Phelps first came to my attention a few years ago because he's got a remix of the Illuminati conspiracy theory in terms of the influence on the Vatican Catholic Church. And his main thesis is that the Vatican Catholic Church has basically been deliberately designed since the last 1,000 years to control all forms of government. And then he's a Protestant Reformationist, so he believes that that's the one true spiritual light to God, and that the Catholics are basically nefarious, evil plotters out to get Protestants and the rest of the world. Okay, one wing of a conspiracy theory, one of the mill, not too surprising, but one of his biggest foes is Alex Jones, who he claims Alex Jones is part of this Vatican conspiracy theory. And it's very similar to what you're saying there when you spoke to that gentleman in the pub who thought that in Ukraine giving a lectures about 9/11 was in on that act. And if someone was slightly more susceptible to paranoid thoughts, they would say that the work that you, Robert, and your colleagues do not really legitimate research, that you're all just fronts for these conspiratorial agents, that someone's paid you to come on and do your public talks and give lectures about what you've been doing in the research and conspiracy theory, but of course it's all fake because you're part of the conspiratorial movement. So it's very interesting in terms of the paranoid aspects of it and also the political aspects of it, because to a certain extent everyone wants to search what is the truth in a social and political world. So when someone like Robert Brotherton or Chris French or someone like Karen Douglas says that this is what we believe influenced people to believe conspiracy theories, certain conspiracy theories would be like, well, no, that's not the case because you're at the mercy and the will of these conspiratorial agents. So it's not just a psychological disposition, it becomes a political movement in itself. They have more to say than just a conspiracy theory. It's about how the world operates economically, socially and politically, which is more of a political science aspect of it, but that's also very interesting, that you can see the political movements that come out of these psychological underpinnings for conspiracy theories. Before I let you go, Rob, because we've been talking about some of the gaps and potential areas in research for psychology and conspiracy theories, what do you think the trend will be for the next few years? What's next on the agenda for psychologists to investigate in terms of conspiracy theories and psychology?
Well, there's a lot going on at the moment. It's been, as I'm sure you know, over the last kind of 3 or 4 decades, there's been just kind of a trickle of studies, a handful of studies. But within the last few years, there's a few people who have been very, very productive, like people like Viren Swamy and Karen Douglas and a few others around the UK. And at the moment, there's myself and one other PhD student here at Goldsmiths working on conspiracy theories, and there's 2 guys at University of Kent working with Karen Douglas as well. So I think over the next few years, it's going to be very, very productive. And we're all, I mean, as far as the PhD students go, I know that we're all coming at it from quite different perspectives. So my research that I've got planned is focusing on the kind of socio-cognitive biases and heuristics and trying to investigate some of the ones that have been looked at already a little bit more and replicate those findings and extend upon them, as well as looking at other biases that haven't been looked at yet and seeing what their role is in conspiracist ideation. Like I said, there's Daniel Jolly at University of Kent. He's working on the kind of consequences, both positive and negative. So that's really important work, especially when it comes to things like anti-vaccinationism, climate change denialism, and things like that, where enough people believing in it can affect everyone else, not just the people who believe in it, but it can have an influence on society as a whole. So I think that's very important. And another aspect is Mike Wood, the other PhD student at University of Kent. He's working on kind of the conspiratorial mindset. So he's published one study with Karen already where they looked at belief in contradictory conspiracy theories. And he's using a kind of network approach to see how all these beliefs relate to one another. So that's really good work. And yeah, so I don't know. It's going to be, I think a lot's going to happen, and it's hard to predict where it's going to go because there's been so little. There still really isn't a kind of coherent framework to build upon. We still need to do that. And from there, I think we'll make a lot of progress.